He sits in a corner booth, his back slightly hunched, the edge of his coat caught beneath the weight of his body like he hasn't noticed it all morning. His phone screen glows every few seconds, a message here, a calendar ping there, a news alert, but he doesn't move. Not really. His headphones are in, but no music plays. He's not listening, just wearing them like a kind of armor, a quiet signal that he's closed for interaction. Around him, the cafe buzzes with the sounds of life, the grind of espresso machines, the clink of ceramic mugs, the laughter of coworkers in some meetings, the sporadic rush of customers grabbing their orders to go. It's an orchestra of daily life, and yet he's not part of the song. He's watching it, like someone pressing their face to the glass of a party they weren't invited. The man checks his phone again, scrolls, nothing changes. Then he locks it and slips it face down on the table. That small act of flipping the phone over feels strangely significant, like he's turning away from a world that promised him connection but gave him distraction instead. He sips his coffee, now lukewarm. His eyes scan the cafe but make contact with no one around him. People talk, not necessarily to him, but about things that don't require his presence. He wonders, not for the first time, how it's possible to be surrounded by so many people and still feel completely invisible. Loneliness doesn't always look like silence. Sometimes, it hides in the noise. This is the paradox of the modern world. We've never been more connected, and yet, so many of us are painfully alone. Not alone, like isolated on a mountain or locked in a room. Alone like unnoticed in a crowd. Alone like being the only one awake at 3 a.m., scrolling through photos of people smiling at dinners you weren't invited to. Alone like speaking out loud and hearing your voice echo because it feels like no one really hears you. That man in the cafe. He's not a rare case. He's the average. He is us. In this moment, this seemingly ordinary, blink-and moment lives the quiet truth that defines an entire generation. We live in cities filled with millions of people. We like, comment, share, snap, post. We tag friends in memes. We respond with emoji instead of words. We voice note instead of call. We join group chats and filter our faces and attend video meetings. But beneath the glittering illusion of hyperconnection lies something more unsettling, a profound and growing epidemic of disconnection. Because loneliness is no longer about solitude. It's not about being physically alone. It's about not feeling seen, not feeling felt. It's about existing without resonance, like shouting into a canyon and never hearing your own echo. And what's more terrifying, we've gotten used to it. We've normalized it. We've built entire lifestyles and digital ecosystems that support being together, alone. But here's the question that breaks the surface of our scrolling, binge-watching, constantly distracted lives. What if loneliness is not a weakness, but a warning system, an evolutionary alarm that modern life has learned to ignore? In the distant past, being alone was dangerous. Evolution didn't design us for independence. It designed us for interdependence. To survive on the savannah or in the frozen north, humans had to band together to find food, care for children, and protect themselves from predators. Connection was key. To be isolated was to be vulnerable. To be alone was, quite literally, to die. So nature, in its brilliant wisdom, built in a mechanism to prevent that, a biological signal, loneliness, to tell us something was wrong, something was missing, something vital. That in fact, when we feel lonely, the brain lights up in ways that are eerily similar to physical pain. The same regions of the brain, particularly the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and anterior insula, are activated when we experience social exclusion, as when we suffer bodily harm. Think about that. Rejection doesn't just hurt metaphorically, it hurts neurologically. The brain treats social pain as if it were a physical wound, because to the brain, it is. This biological alarm system served us well for millennia. But in the world we've created one with digital friends and remote work and curated avatars, that alarm keeps ringing, and we keep muting it. We override it with dopamine jolts from scrolling. We silence it with distractions. We pretend we're fine, but our bodies, our brains, our immune systems, even our genes, are telling a different story. One of chronic stress, of social starvation. Recent studies have begun to reveal just how devastating this condition truly is. In 2015, A massive meta-analysis of over 3.4 million participants found that chronic loneliness increased a person's risk of early death by 26%, more than obesity and on par with smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Think about that. If a friend told you they were smoking 15 cigarettes a day, you'd probably urge them to stop. But if they told you they felt painfully alone, you might say, hang in there, and move on. Society doesn't treat loneliness like a health crisis, but science says it is, and it goes deeper. Loneliness doesn't just make us feel sad. It rewires the architecture of the brain. It increases activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, making us more hypervigilant, more anxious, more likely to see the world as threatening. It weakens the prefrontal cortex, the region involved in empathy, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Over time, it can change the way we perceive others. We become more suspicious, less trusting. Loneliness makes us defend instead of connect. It creates a feedback loop where the lonelier we feel, the more we pull away, and the more we pull away, the lonelier we get. On a cellular level, loneliness increases inflammation. It compromises the immune system, making us more vulnerable to illness. It accelerates aging. In one study, researchers found that lonely people exhibited changes in the expression of genes involved in antiviral responses. In other words, loneliness doesn't just change how we feel, it changes our biology. It writes itself into the body, so we must ask, how can a species built on connection be dying from disconnection? This contradiction is at the heart of our age, and it's not just personal, it's global. Rates of reported loneliness have surged across all demographics: children, teenagers, adults, and especially the elderly. It transcends culture, geography, and class. It shows up in the boardroom and the bedroom, in cities and in suburbs, in schools and on social media feeds. We've mistaken connectivity for connection, information for intimacy. And in doing so, we've triggered an evolutionary emergency response that we don't even recognize as a crisis. Because loneliness isn't just a feeling. It's not a personality flaw or a mood swing. It's a biological danger signal. A flare shot up by the nervous system. A cry from the body saying, I cannot survive like this. The stakes couldn't be higher. For individuals, chronic loneliness increases the risk of depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, stroke, dementia, and suicide. For societies, it erodes empathy, increases polarization, and weakens the social fabric that binds us. Loneliness is not a side effect of modern life. It is a symptom of something much deeper, something structural, cultural, and profoundly human. And perhaps the most insidious part is this: loneliness is invisible. It doesn't show up in public health stats like heart disease or cancer. It doesn't announce itself in emergency rooms. It hides in plain sight. In the man at the cafe, in the colleague who never speaks unless spoken to, in the woman who posts smiling selfies but cries herself to sleep, in the child who spends hours on TikTok but hasn't had a real conversation in weeks. Loneliness is silent, but it is screaming. So, the question we must now ask, urgently, openly, and scientifically, is not just how did we get here, but what is this doing to us? What happens when an entire species, wired for connection, starts to starve? Absolutely. Here is the asterisk next 1500 plus word paragraph, asterisk for your script section titled, Let's begin where the story of loneliness truly begins, not in modern cities or therapy offices, not in news headlines or social media feeds, but deep in the Paleolithic wilderness, around 200,000 years ago, when early Homo sapiens first walked the earth. Imagine this world, not the world of smart homes and notifications, but of roaring predators, sudden storms, firelight, and raw survival. Life then was not just hard, it was precarious. Every day was a tightrope walk between hunger and hunt, between life and extinction. And in that fragile reality, a single truth governed everything: to be alone was to die. For our ancestors, solitude wasn't a time for self-reflection. It was a biological emergency. A lone human was vulnerable to cold, to predators, to starvation, to rival tribes. We weren't the fastest animals, nor the strongest, nor the most naturally armored, but we had one superpower that made survival not only possible but eventually inevitable: connection. We bonded. We shared fire. We hunted in groups. We sang, painted caves, built rituals. And most importantly, we took care of each other. The evolution of our species is not a tale of individual triumphs, but of collective resilience. It's social cooperation, not solitude, that carved our evolutionary path. And just as the body maintains balance in temperature, blood pressure, or hunger through systems like homeostasis, nature gave us a similar system to regulate our need for social contact. Scientists now call this social homeostasis, a brilliant internal thermostat that monitors the warmth and proximity of human connection. When we have enough closeness, intimacy, and interaction, this system tells the brain, all is well. But when we lack it, when we're isolated, ignored, or disconnected, the brain sends out an alarm. That alarm is what we call loneliness. Far from being a modern mood disorder or psychological inconvenience, loneliness is an evolutionary warning system. It's no different from hunger or thirst. When you're hungry, it means your body needs nutrients. When you're lonely, it means your nervous system and your species need connection. And just like starvation leads to the breakdown of physical systems, chronic loneliness leads to the breakdown of social and biological systems. We were never meant to endure life alone. Our brains, our hormones, our immune systems all evolved with social interaction as a critical survival input. Without it, we begin to unravel. This isn't poetry, it's measurable biology. Over the past 2 decades, the field of social neuroscience has made incredible strides in decoding how the human brain perceives isolation. One of the foundational figures in this domain was Dr. John Cacioppo, a pioneering neuroscientist who essentially created the field of modern loneliness research. He argued that loneliness is not a character flaw or personal failing, but a fundamental biological signal, no less real than physical pain or fever. Cacioppo's groundbreaking fMRI studies demonstrated that the brains of lonely people process the world differently. Specifically, lonely individuals exhibit heightened activity in the brain's threat detection systems, particularly in the amygdala and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. This means that isolation doesn't just feel bad emotionally, it literally rewires the brain into a state of hypervigilance. Lonely brains scan the environment more for danger, interpret neutral faces as hostile, and perceive the world through a darker, more suspicious lens. It's as though the brain, sensing abandonment, shifts into defensive mode, biologically priming itself for a harsher, more dangerous world. But loneliness doesn't just affect the mind, it cascades throughout the entire body. Elevated cortisol levels, the primary stress hormone, surge in socially isolated individuals. Chronic cortisol exposure is toxic, increasing the risk of heart disease, diabetes, memory loss, and immune dysfunction. At the same time, oxytocin, the hormone responsible for bonding, trust, and soothing mirror neurons, the systems in the brain that allow us to empathize with others and feel their emotions, grow less active when we're alone for too long. In effect, the longer we remain disconnected, the harder it becomes to re-engage. The very circuitry that makes connection possible begins to corrode. This is how loneliness transitions from a signal into a trap. A temporary alarm becomes a chronic illness. We feel disconnected, and so we withdraw further. We misread social cues, become more anxious in public, and mistrust others, all of which increases the odds of being rejected again. And slowly, this cycle begins to feed itself. Over weeks, months, years, our very sense of self begins to shift. We are no longer people who are lonely. We become the lonely. A subtle but devastating identity transformation. The tragedy is compounded by how society views this condition. Unlike physical ailments, loneliness carries a silent stigma. It's often treated as a personal failing, a sign that someone is not likable, not social enough, not strong enough. We praise independence. We valorize self-sufficiency. We tell people to work on themselves, to love themselves first, as if human connection is a luxury, not a need. But this is a profound misunderstanding of biology. No one would tell a starving person to just love themselves more instead of eating. Yet we tell the lonely to stop needing others, as though that need is shameful. But needing others isn't weakness. It's the oldest survival instinct we have. This pathological framing of loneliness is relatively new. For most of human history, solitude was seen as punishment. Exile, banishment, and social shunning were among the most feared consequences in ancient tribes and communities. Even in modern times, solitary confinement is used as a severe form of incarceration, not because it's violent, but because it breaks the mind. Loneliness has always been recognized, deep down, as unbearable. But something changed in the last century. The rise of hyper-individualism, consumer culture, and digital communication rebranded isolation as freedom. We began to worship independence while quietly suffering from disconnection. We created a world where people could survive alone, but not thrive. And now, the results are becoming visible in the data, in the brain scans, in the lives unraveling silently behind closed doors and lit up screens. Let me know when you're ready for the next paragraph, 1500 plus words, which will cover science and origin, Dr. Cacioppo's legacy, fMRI findings, oxytocin and cortisol, mirror neurons, and how loneliness became pathologized. Sometimes, science stumbles upon a truth so unexpected that it shifts not only what we know but how we live. For decades, loneliness was categorized as a psychological nuisance, a feeling, an unfortunate byproduct of circumstances, something to get over, like a cold. But a turning point emerged in the early 21st century, not from philosophy or poetry, but from the intricate corridors of molecular biology. What researchers discovered was staggering. Loneliness doesn't just change how you feel, it changes who you are at the level of your genes. In a groundbreaking study led by Dr. Steve Cole, in collaboration with Dr. John Cacioppo, researchers at UCLA made a discovery that rewrote the biology of human connection. They found that chronic loneliness can alter gene expression, the process by which certain genes are switched on or off. It wasn't just that lonely people felt worse. Their bodies were behaving as though they were under constant, invisible attack. Specifically, genes associated with inflammatory responses were turned on, while genes associated with antiviral defenses were turned off. Pause here. This isn't metaphor, it's molecular. Loneliness was literally rewriting the immune system, recalibrating the body's defense strategies in a maladaptive way. Inflammatory genes ramped up as though the body were preparing for physical injury, a nod, perhaps, to ancient times when social isolation meant a higher likelihood of being wounded without help. Meanwhile, antiviral genes, the body's critical shield against viruses, were suppressed, leaving lonely individuals more vulnerable to infections, illnesses, and disease. It was as if the body, deprived of social connection, entered into a long, slow emergency mode, constantly scanning for threat, bracing for harm, and overcompensating in all the wrong places. This shift became known as the conserved response to adversity, CTRA, a common pattern of genetic change triggered by prolonged stress, fear, and crucially, loneliness. It meant that loneliness wasn't just a feeling to be brushed aside. It was a biological wound, as serious and consequential as any injury. The immune system was not designed to operate this way long term. Chronic inflammation is the bedrock of many degenerative diseases, including cancer, heart disease, arthritis, and Alzheimer's. And so, what we used to call a soft problem, emotional pain, was, in fact, seeding hard consequences. The premature aging of the body, the slow erosion of its cellular integrity. But the genetic discovery was only the beginning. As neuroscience advanced, researchers began to peer deeper into the architecture of the brain itself. What they found echoed and amplified the same disturbing truth. The brain treats social rejection like physical injury. In study after study, using fMRI scans, scientists observed that when participants experienced feelings of exclusions, such as being left out of a game or ignored by peers, the same brain regions lit up as when they were subjected to physical pain. Chief among these was the anterior cingulate cortex, a key hub for processing both physical pain and emotional distress. It's a stunning overlap. The wiring for social pain and physical pain are not separate, they are entangled. This makes evolutionary sense. In a prehistoric world, social exclusion likely preceded physical danger. To be cast out from the group was to lose access to shelter, food, and protection. So the brain, in its evolutionary brilliance, ensured that social loss would hurt viscerally, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but neurologically. To be lonely, in the deepest sense, is to feel the echo of physical damage without a visible wound. It is to bleed without blood. The emotional intensity of this fact is matched only by its societal blindness, because while science was uncovering the lethal seriousness of loneliness, culture was still treating it like a mood problem, a soft issue. Meanwhile, new research continued to mount. A longitudinal Harvard study, spanning over 75 years and tracking hundreds of participants from young adulthood into old age, found a stark conclusion: the single most important predictor of health, happiness, and longevity wasn't wealth, intelligence, or even genetics. It was close, stable, meaningful relationships. Participants who reported feeling lonely in midlife were significantly more likely to experience faster cognitive decline, higher rates of physical illness, and shorter lifespans. Loneliness didn't just correlate with suffering, it predicted it. It was a diagnostic signal, years before symptoms emerged. And this wasn't a fringe finding. Subsequent studies replicated it across cultures and populations. Loneliness predicted higher blood pressure, poorer sleep, greater dementia risk, and even impaired wound healing. The message couldn't be clearer: our biology is social. Our health depends on others. Connection is medicine. Disconnection is poison. So here we arrive at the core dilemma, the moment where science crashes into culture, and facts become moral provocations. If loneliness is this deadly, this biologically corrosive, why do we continue to dismiss it? Why is it still stigmatized, hidden, and silenced? This is not just a medical question, it's a philosophical and societal one. What kind of world creates conditions where a biologically normal need is labeled a failure? Where the desire for closeness is treated as weakness? Where we encourage people to live independently, but leave them sick with invisibility? This is the contradiction at the heart of modern life. We are a society that glorifies individualism, that markets self-reliance as virtue, and celebrates isolation as strength. We tell people to build their own empires, chase their own goals, stand on their own. We build digital infrastructures that prioritize connection without proximity, intimacy without touch, community without presence. And then we wonder why we are falling apart mentally, physically, spiritually. We wonder why anxiety, depression, and autoimmune disorders are surging. We wonder why we feel so alone, even when everyone is just a tap away. But biology doesn't bend to ideology. It doesn't care if society prefers independence. The nervous system evolved in tribes, not studios. The brain expects eye contact, not pixels. Oxytocin is released from touch, not texts. The immune system stabilizes when we feel loved, not followed. So, the moral question is this: should loneliness be treated as a public health crisis or remain a private shame? If loneliness truly rewires genes, accelerates disease, and shortens life, how can we ignore it as merely a personal issue? We don't treat heart disease that way. We don't ask the depressed to simply cheer up and move on. And yet, we do this daily, silently, to the lonely. Should governments be responsible for reducing societal loneliness? Should public health campaigns address connection like they do smoking or obesity? Should schools teach emotional bonding as seriously as they do math? Should workplaces measure social well-being the way they measure productivity? And perhaps the most urgent dilemma of all, can a civilization that deprioritizes touch, proximity, and interdependence even survive? This is not just a crisis of health, it is a crisis of design, a civilizational error that mistakes isolation for evolution. In our attempt to become smarter, faster, and more efficient, we have designed systems that are inhuman to the core biological truth of who we are. And the evidence is mounting, from gene expression to neural architecture, from the Harvard longevity data to rising rates of depression and addiction. The message is loud, even if it is unspoken. We are dying of loneliness, silently, invisibly, systematically. And the question, now, more than ever, is, what are we going to do about it? As scientific understanding of loneliness deepens, so does the debate, not just over solutions, but over the very nature of the condition itself. Is loneliness a root cause of psychological breakdown? Or is it simply a symptom, the visible scar tissue of deeper wounds like depression, anxiety, or trauma? This question, seemingly philosophical, is at the heart of an ongoing and often heated divide across disciplines. Neuroscience, psychology, and sociology each interpret loneliness through different lenses, and these perspectives lead to radically different conclusions about both what loneliness is and what we should do about it. To a neuroscientist, loneliness is fundamentally biological, a signal generated by the brain's social systems, much like hunger or pain. Dr. Stephanie Kachop, continuing the legacy of her late husband Dr. John Kachop, argues that loneliness is a brain state, one marked by changes in the anterior cingulate cortex, prefrontal cortex, and amygdala, among others. The brain, in the absence of sufficient social contact, becomes hyperactive in threat detection and less regulated in emotional balance. In this view, loneliness is a primary condition, a driver of cognitive and emotional degradation, not merely a result of it. It reshapes perception, increases cortisol levels, and rewires the default mode network of the brain. From this perspective, treating loneliness requires altering the brain's patterns, not just the person's social behavior. Psychologists, however, often see loneliness as a secondary manifestation, a visible expression of underlying mental health challenges. Many in this field argue that loneliness is frequently caused by distorted self-image, trauma, depression, or social anxiety, and that interventions should target these root causes. For them, loneliness is not the fire, it's the smoke. The logic follows that if we help individuals rebuild self-worth, process past wounds, and regulate anxiety, their capacity to form meaningful relationships will naturally return. Loneliness, in this frame, is the consequence, not the origin, of mental distress. Meanwhile, sociologists push back against both views. They argue that loneliness isn't primarily internal at all, it's structural. According to researchers like Dr. Eric Klinenberg, loneliness stems not from a malfunctioning brain or unresolved childhood trauma, but from the architecture of modern society, the way our cities are built, the way we separate generations, the way we isolate the elderly, the way we fragment community. From this view, loneliness is a systemic failure, a product of capitalism, urban design, neoliberal individualism, and the collapse of traditional social institutions like churches, unions, and neighborhoods. You can't cure systemic loneliness, they say. By fixing individuals, you have to redesign the culture. These tensions play out not just in academic journals, but in real-world policies. Should we fund more mental health therapy for lonely individuals? Or should we redesign housing, public parks, and transit systems to encourage daily human interaction? Should we train doctors to screen for loneliness as a biological threat? Or should we advocate for universal basic income so that people have more time to invest in relationships? The disagreement isn't just scientific, it's philosophical, and the stakes are high. Nowhere is this more evident than in the pharmaceutical industry's increasing interest in loneliness as a profitable frontier, with loneliness now linked to depression, cardiovascular disease, dementia, and autoimmune dysfunction. Pharmaceutical companies see an opportunity, or perhaps a temptation. Could loneliness be treated with a pill? The prospect is seductive. After all, if loneliness is correlated with elevated cortisol or underactive oxytocin systems, why not intervene chemically? Researchers have explored nasal sprays of oxytocin, SSR, is to blunt emotional pain, and even anti-inflammatory drugs to mitigate loneliness's physiological effects. Trials are underway to assess whether medications used for depression or anxiety could be repurposed to reduce the emotional distress of loneliness. But this raises deep ethical and existential questions. Can a chemical surrogate ever replace a human bond? Is it moral to numb the signal of loneliness without addressing its cause? If we dull the pain but do nothing to create belonging, are we truly helping, or merely anesthetizing? There's a haunting parallel here to the opioid crisis, where pain was treated as a condition rather than a symptom, and entire communities were left in pharmacological limbo, numbed but unhealed. Even if such drugs could safely reduce the suffering of chronic loneliness, they would do nothing to fix the real causes: the breakdown of community, the dissolution of families, the culture of workaholism, the digitization of intimacy. The danger is not just that we'll try to medicate loneliness, it's that we'll medicalize it, framing it as a disorder of the individual rather than a disorder of the collective. Once again, the burden would fall on the isolated person to fix themselves, while society remains unchanged. And yet, people are desperate. The demand for solutions is overwhelming, which leads us deeper into the next set of rising conflicts, not just among scientists, but in how we've designed our world, and whether that design is compatible with the biology of belonging. There's a strange and haunting irony at the core of loneliness, one that science has only recently begun to uncover. We tend to imagine loneliness as a private struggle, locked away inside individuals, one person, one life, one mind. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if loneliness, like laughter or yawning or mood, is contagious not metaphorically, but biologically? What if the most isolating condition in the world spreads? For in a landmark study that rewrote the way researchers understand social behavior, psychologists John Cacioppo, James Fowler, and Nicholas Christakis analyzed over 5,000 individuals in the Framingham Heart Study, a long-term, multi-decade examination of health trends in one American town. What they discovered was shocking. Loneliness propagates through social networks much like a virus. If someone in your immediate social circle becomes lonely, your chances of feeling lonely rise by 52%. Even if a friend of a friend becomes lonely, your odds increase. The further loneliness reaches into your social web, the more vulnerable you become. Why does this happen? Because loneliness alters behavior in subtle but powerful ways. When we feel isolated, our brains shift into self-protection mode. Evolution designed this state for survival. The lone individual needed heightened threat awareness, hypervigilance, and emotional boundaries. But in the context of modern society, this ancient software backfires. The lonely person begins to misread social cues. Neutral glances are perceived as hostile. Ambiguity becomes threat. They speak less, smile less, avoid eye contact. Their posture closes in. Their tone becomes guarded, and those around them, even if they care, begin to sense this withdrawal, this emotional contraction. And here's the twist: we subconsciously mirror each other. Humans are wired for mimicry. Through mirror neurons and emotional synchrony, we pick up on each other's moods, body language, and affect. So when we spend time around someone experiencing loneliness, especially chronic loneliness, we begin to subtly adopt their defenses. We, too, might become less trusting, more self-protective, less open. Over time, entire microcommunities can become emotionally distant, guarded, and withdrawn, not because any one person is bad at connection, but because the contagion of mistrust has spread. Loneliness, then, isn't just a personal affliction. It's a social toxin, diffusing silently through networks, workplaces, families, and schools. And the cruel paradox is that the very behaviors loneliness produces, emotional guardedness, pessimism, suspicion, are the very ones that make reconnection harder. It's an evolutionary feedback loop gone rogue. A defense mechanism designed to signal "I need help" ends up pushing help away. A body designed to seek warmth becomes a fortress that radiates cold. Neuroscientific studies confirm this loop in stunning detail. Functional MRI scans of chronically lonely individuals show increased activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear processing center, and decreased connectivity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for empathy and social regulation. Over time, the lonely brain literally begins to see the world as more threatening. Even ambiguous social stimuli, a text delay, a neutral facial expression, are interpreted as rejection. The brain begins to anticipate abandonment, and so, it withdraws preemptively. This neurobiological expectation of harm becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I don't let anyone close, they can't hurt me. But no one gets close. And the cycle deepens. What began as a signal, "I need connection," turns into a pattern. "I can't trust anyone." That's the real twist. The biological system meant to bring us back into the tribe, if left unanswered, pushes us further out. This is not maladaptive behavior in evolutionary terms. It's overadaptive. It's the social equivalent of an immune system attacking its own tissues. Loneliness becomes autosocial, a condition where the self, trying to survive, ends up isolating itself to death. And yet, amid this dark architecture, a philosophical light begins to emerge, a reframing that changes everything. What if loneliness isn't about being alone? What if it's about not being seen? This is a radical and liberating shift in perspective, because it means the cure for loneliness isn't just more people, more noise, or more interaction. It's recognition, resonance. To be lonely is to feel emotionally invisible, to go through life like a ghost, unmirrored, unacknowledged, untouched by presence. And this, perhaps, is the most tragic feature of modern life. We are increasingly surrounded by people, but we are rarely present for one another. Our eyes are on screens. Our attention is fragmented. Our interactions are performative. We communicate, but we do not connect. We respond, but we do not resonate. We have structured society in ways that make visibility, true emotional presence, difficult. We reward productivity over intimacy. We design cities that isolate rather than integrate. We separate generations into boxes: daycare here, school there, retirement home, far away. We prioritize independence so highly that we forget how to depend. And in this design, the architecture of empathy collapses. No wonder our biology is screaming. But here's the unexpected revelation. This spiral is not inevitable. The contagion of loneliness, like any epidemic, can be interrupted not through technology, not through pharmaceuticals, but through proximity, time, and emotional presence. And in one corner of the world, a living experiment proved exactly that. In the Netherlands, a visionary retirement home implemented a radical idea. Instead of housing only the elderly, they created an intergenerational living model, a community where university students lived side by side with seniors in exchange for reduced rent. These young people didn't just provide company, they brought energy, curiosity, music, and storytelling. They learned from the elderly, and the elderly, in turn, rediscovered purpose. They taught, laughed, danced, cooked, and cried together. The results were astonishing. Within 1 year, loneliness rates among the elderly dropped by 85%. But more importantly, the entire emotional ecology of the facility changed. Residents who once sat in silence now played games and shared stories. Students who came for cheap housing left with honorary grandparents. The community became alive, not because of technology or policy or digital solutions, but because of human time, shared space, daily presence. It's a case study that explodes all modern assumptions. The solution to loneliness is not more connection apps, but more connection acts. Not more stimulation, but more stillness. Not artificial intelligence, but authentic presence. The key was never to make us more connected in number, but more connected in meaning. And this, perhaps, is the final twist. Loneliness is not a punishment. It is not a defect. It is not even a problem to be solved. It is a message, a beautifully evolved signal reminding us of something we've forgotten. We were never meant to go through life unnoticed. Once, loneliness was invisible. It lived in the margins of medicine, unquantified, unaddressed, dismissed as merely a feeling, something vague, personal, sad, perhaps, but not urgent. But that era is over. Today, science speaks a new language, and in that language, loneliness is biological, mappable, predictable, treatable. It is no longer an invisible ache hiding inside hearts. It is a measurable signal flowing through brainwaves, immune cells, and nervous systems. It changes the way your body functions, how your genes express, how your neurons fire. And now, perhaps for the first time in human history, we are learning how to respond. It begins with a radical shift in thinking. What if loneliness is a medical condition? Not just metaphorically, but clinically. In the UK, this shift has already begun. In 2018, the country appointed the world's first minister for loneliness, recognizing it as a public health crisis on par with smoking, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. The move wasn't symbolic. It was grounded in hard science. Meta-analyses show that chronic loneliness increases mortality by 26%, raises the risk of heart disease, stroke, cognitive decline, and depression, and even suppresses immune function. It activates the same neural pain circuits as physical injury. In short, loneliness kills, slowly, quietly, but relentlessly. And so, a new field has emerged, one that treats social connection not as a luxury, but as medicine. It's called social prescribing. Imagine walking into your doctor's office with symptoms of fatigue, anxiety, or chronic pain, and instead of a pill, you're given a prescription for weekly group walks, storytelling circles, or intergenerational community gardening. That's not a fantasy. It's happening across the UK, Canada, and parts of Europe. Doctors are partnering with link workers, professionals trained to connect patients with meaningful social engagement. And the science backs it up. In one study, patients with long-term conditions who received social prescriptions reported 37% fewer emergency room visits, and depression scores dropped significantly. In another trial, older adults who participated in group choirs and arts workshops showed measurable increases in oxytocin, the brain's social bonding hormone, and decreases in cortisol, the stress hormone that loneliness chronically elevates. But what makes these interventions truly powerful isn't just that they offer distraction or entertainment, it's that they reignite the social brain. Neuroscientists now understand that the brain has dedicated networks for social cognition. Regions like the medial prefrontal cortex, temporoparietal junction, and default mode network that light up during eye contact, shared laughter, or cooperative tasks. These areas, like unused muscles, can go quiet during prolonged isolation. But thanks to the brain's extraordinary plasticity, they can also reactivate. In lab experiments, even brief social exposure to 10 minutes of direct eye contact, synchronized movement, or genuine conversation begins to recalibrate these dormant systems. In fMRI scans, lonely individuals who engage in consistent social routines show increased connectivity in empathy-related networks over time. It's not just psychological, it's structural. The social circuits can come back online, and it turns out they are exquisitely sensitive to sensory input. This is one of the most astonishing recent findings in the science of connection. The nervous system doesn't just respond to words, it responds to touch, scent, voice, and gaze. These ancient signals of mammalian safety, the very cues we evolved to detect warmth and belonging, are neurochemical triggers. A hug, for example, isn't just comforting. It releases oxytocin, lowers blood pressure, and slows the heart rate. A familiar scent, like a loved one's sweater, activates the olfactory limbic pathway, directly stimulating emotional memory centers like the amygdala and hippocampus. Even hearing a familiar voice can cause a measurable decrease in cortisol. These responses are not metaphors. They are biological effects, and together, they form what trauma researchers call co-regulation, the process by which nervous systems synchronize with others to restore equilibrium. We are not meant to regulate alone. The solitary body, under prolonged emotional stress, becomes dysregulated. Heart rhythms scatter, stress hormones surge, inflammatory genes turn on. But when another person enters the space, with presence, with safety, with attention, the nervous system settles. That's the miracle. Connection is not merely psychological comfort, it is biological calibration. These insights are beginning to transform how we approach everything from elder care to education. In Sweden, some memory care homes now use scent-based therapy, where patients with dementia are exposed to smells from their childhood, baking bread, leather, forest, rain, to activate emotional memory. The result? Residents who were previously nonverbal begin to speak, smile, and share stories. In the US, pilot programs are using eye contact therapy, prolonged, silent eye gazing between caregivers and patients, to rebuild trust and social responsiveness in individuals with severe PTSD. And yet, among the most powerful proofs of this science comes not from labs, but from life. From those who have lived on the edge of social disappearance and found their way back. We often think of loneliness as the absence of other people, an empty room, a silent phone, an unanswered message. But in truth, loneliness is something far more intimate and more invisible. It is not about being without others. It is about being without meaning, without witness. It is a kind of existential mute button, where the soul keeps speaking but nothing echoes back. The body is present. The world is spinning. The light filters through the curtains just the same. But inside, in that quiet space no stethoscope can reach, there is a voice that says, "Do I matter? Can anyone see me? Is anyone real enough to reflect me back to myself?" That is the loneliness no selfie can fix. No notification can soothe. No crowd can solve. It is the ache of existing without resonance. And biologically, that ache is now understood as more than just metaphor. It is neurochemical, inflammatory, epigenetic. But beyond the science, beyond the gene shifts and cortical changes, there is a spiritual architecture to this wound, a structure of absence, a phantom imprint of what should be there, but isn't, recognition, attention, presence. We live in an era of unprecedented communication, and yet our inner lives often go entirely unwitnessed. We share statuses, but not stories. We broadcast thoughts, but few truly listen. We are hypervisible and deeply unseen. And here lies the paradox. Loneliness has evolved from a condition of social scarcity to one of emotional starvation in plain sight. The tables are crowded, but no one makes eye contact. The inbox is full, but the messages are hollow. The feed is infinite, but the feeling is famished. Science tells us that being seen is not just emotional comfort, it is survival-level necessity. In evolutionary terms, being recognized by the tribe meant protection, food, reproduction. To be unseen was to be unchosen. To be unchosen was to be in danger. That same primal circuitry still lives inside us. When we are ignored, excluded, or invisible, The brain responds as if under attack. Cortisol rises. Inflammatory markers increase. The anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain that processes physical pain, lights up. Emotional abandonment becomes a wound the body cannot distinguish from physical injury. But it's not just that we are not seen, it's that we stop seeing ourselves. Chronic loneliness distorts self-perception. Studies show that the longer someone experiences social isolation, the more they begin to internalize rejection, expect hostility, and withdraw preemptively. A lonely person doesn't just fear the world, they begin to feel undeserving of its attention. This is the cruel twist. Loneliness teaches the brain to push away the very connection it needs. It becomes a cognitive and emotional loop, a feedback system of silence. And yet, at the center of that silence, there is still a voice, small, struggling, waiting. That's what makes this so profoundly human. No matter how long the disconnection, no matter how deep the solitude, some part of us always keeps whispering, maybe someone will see me. Maybe someone will understand. It's a voice that refuses extinction. A neurochemical ember that refuses to die out, even in darkness, even in grief, even in years of neglect. That whisper is, perhaps, the most resilient part of our species, and here lies the philosophical pivot. What if loneliness is not the absence of people, but the absence of being mirrored, of being responded to, not just with attention, but with meaningful presence? What if loneliness is a spiritual hunger, not just for proximity, but for authentic resonance? Someone who looks at you and says, I hear you, you are real to me, you exist. This shifts everything. It reframes the problem, and thus the cure. Because if loneliness is not a lack of bodies, but a lack of witnessing, then the solution is not more noise. It is not more followers, more messages, more digital contact. The solution is more attention, more stillness, more real-time presence. The very things modern life has trained us to ignore. We scroll past each other's lives like spectators, but healing begins when we pause, truly pause, and let someone in. When we ask not, how are you, but what's been heavy for you lately? When we stop looking through people and start looking at them, into them. And when we allow ourselves to be looked into, to be seen, because the truth is, the act of witnessing is what makes a person real. In trauma therapy, this is a known phenomenon. When someone is given compassionate presence, their story begins to shift. The neural circuits.com, the breath slows, the pain becomes integrated instead of fragmented. It's not magic, it's co-regulation, it's biology. But it feels like a miracle, and in a way, it is, because to be heard, truly heard, is to remember that you are not alone in your aloneness, that someone has stepped inside your silence and said, I'm here, I won't turn away. That echo, that return, is what tells the brain it is safe again, that it doesn't have to fight, doesn't have to hide, that the war is over. So perhaps the final truth is this: loneliness isn't silence, it's the unheard voice inside us, waiting for someone to echo back. And connection is not noise, it is not activity, it is not presence by default, it is the brave, conscious, active art of seeing another, and letting ourselves be seen. Which brings us to the question we must all carry: if connection is as vital to human survival as food and water, why do we treat it like a luxury? Why do our cities prioritize speed over touch? Why do our institutions measure productivity but not belonging? Why do we train our children in mathematics but not in how to offer presence? Why do we spend so many years building technologies to connect and so few hours learning to actually listen? It's not that we don't care, it's that we've forgotten how. Or we've gotten so distracted by the performance of connection that we've lost the practice of it. But there is hope, always, because presence is a renewable resource. It doesn't cost money. It doesn't require degrees. It only asks for attention, time, courage, slowness. It asks us to stop rushing, to meet each other's eyes, to ask the real questions, and to listen, not to fix, not to interrupt, not to perform empathy, but simply to be with. That is enough. In the end, maybe the cure for loneliness isn't more content, it's more contact, not more clicks, more closeness, not more apps, more awe. The kind that happens when two people are fully present, even for a moment, and something ancient inside says, I remember this, I remember you.